Welcome everyone who's here for this upcoming book talk it's essentially about this book, Crossing Broadway, Washington Heights, and the Promise of New York City by the author who's present with us, Robert W Snyder. And we're going to take the opportunity of this hour though to have, to go beyond the book and have a conversation between Robert and Carlos, also known as Feegz to many of you. But before we get into that, I'm going to introduce Jackie Tesman from Cloth, Community League of the Heights, who will introduce this whole series of events.
Hi, thank you, Veronica, and hello, everybody. I'm Jackie Tesman. I'm a project manager at Community League of the Heights, also known as Cloth. You may or may not know about the agency. They have been serving Washington Heights for over 60 years. They have several programs. Our big program is we manage affordable housing. They have after-school programs, pantry. They have a pantry, which I'm sure everybody knows there's a lot of food insecurity right now due to COVID. So they're literally giving out 500, 600, 700 bags of groceries a day. My program is economic development, commercial revitalization, and all that really means is right now I am helping small businesses. This book club is part of a series that we are doing in collaboration with Veronica, with Word Up Community Books, and with Jennifer Wilson of Sisters Uptown Bookstore. We are alternating Saturdays. We're alternating bookstores every Saturday from June 13th to August 28th. We are going to feature local authors, local artists, and a local business. And just one word about local businesses, and I'm sure we're all aware of this, but COVID hit them extremely, extremely hard. So now more than ever, it's important that you spend your money locally, that you buy from all of your local stores in your neighborhood. This will keep their storefronts open, keep people employed, and keep the character of the neighborhood, which is the most important out of everything. And just a word of thanks to LISC, our funder, Local Initiative Support Corporation. Thank you, obviously, to Veronica from Word Up for hosting these book clubs, and to Jennifer from Sisters Uptown Bookstore for hosting the book clubs. And also to NOMA, Northern Manhattan Arts Alliance, for collaborating with us on everything. And our next book club is next Saturday, June 27th, with Sisters Uptown Bookstore. The link will be available on Heights Sites. You could register for their newsletter and you'll get it automatically delivered to you every week, or you could direct message me. I'll put my email in the chat over there, and I'll send you the link. And we are featuring the author Hopshop Vincent, the artist Wilhelmina Grants, and the business Blue Mountain Cafe, which is a Caribbean Jamaican restaurant on 158th Street, Broadway. And thank you.
Thanks, Jackie, for bringing us into this project and for explaining more about what Cloth does. I also want to give a shout out to Wilhelmina Grant, who I know is in the audience here. We look forward to next week. And for those who have never been to Word Up, I just wanted to give you a quick introduction. We're a bookshop and art space run by local residents, most of whom are volunteers. And when we're not experiencing a pandemic, we will be open more regular hours at 2113 Amsterdam at the corner of 165th Street in Washington Heights. We may have some regular hours coming up very soon, starting this coming week, but we'll be announcing that on social media and otherwise. But please follow us at Word Up Books to just find out when there could be some short pickup hours. We normally do a lot of events for all ages and sell used and new books in English and Spanish. And we hope you'll visit us when we're finally open again. To help cover some of the things that have happened while we've been closed, we started a GoFundMe campaign to maintain our space and meet obligations while closed, and I'll share that link shortly. And let's move on to the exciting part here, this talk. Robert W. Snyder is a professor of journalism and American studies at Rutgers University, Newark, and Manhattan Borough historian. It's a newly bestowed honor just in the past few months. Most recently, he's the author of Crossing Broadway, Washington Heights and the Promise of New York, and co-author of All the Nations Under Heaven, Immigrants, Migrants, and the Making of New York. He's a former Fulbright lecturer in American Studies in Korea and a member of the New York Academy History. Joining him will be Jesus Martinez Dominguez, aka Feegz, who's exhibited and taught and spoken in dozens of institutions nationally and internationally. He's, identifies as a Caribbean New Yorker, an atheist on some days, non-theist agnostic on others. He's liberal, socialist, agitator, ethical, polyamorous, marijuana advocate, high school dropout, GED holder, autodidact, educator, debater, white people fearing, all loving, LGBTQ allying, hip hop seeker, comic, and sci-fi loving Dominican Puerto Rican interdisciplinary artist, born on a military base in North Carolina in 1976, and he's been in New York since 1982. So I welcome both of you and look forward to this conversation about Washington Heights, which both of you have so much historical knowledge and also a lot of lived experience of. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Veronica and Jackie. I want to thank everybody that was mentioned when Jackie was speaking. Veronica, I want to especially thank you and Word Up Books. You guys have supported my art for a very long time. And I love the fact that you thought about me for this talk. I'm really, really honored to be here with Robert. The book is phenomenal. And then I found out he's the actual historian of Manhattan. I was like, wow, I'm gonna have a conversation with this dude. And we got on the phone and we started talking, and we really, I really enjoyed the conversation. We really started throwing back and forth information on the neighborhood. So I'm thrilled to be here with Robert Snyder going over his book once again, Crossing Broadway. And I just want to get straight up into the conversation. Robert, I dug through interviews and so on, but for people that don't know, maybe you can give us a little bit of why you even started your interest in Washington Heights, particularly because you're Manhattan's, historian, and there's so much information in Manhattan. What made you focus on Washington Heights, this somewhat quiet neighborhood in the history of New York?
I focused on Washington Heights for two reasons. One of them had to do with my family, and one of them had to do with what was going on in the city in the 1980s. It was partly with my family because both my parents lived in Washington Heights when they got married in 1952. My father had grown up there in the 30s and 40s, and when he came home from the Army after World War II and he married my mom, they moved into Washington Heights. They only stayed there for a year when I was born, and we moved to the suburbs in New Jersey. But I grew up in a suburban town in North Jersey, a place called Dumont, listening to my parents' stories about Washington Heights. And in a suburb where a lot of the people were very fearful of the city, they didn't want to go into the city, it made them very edgy, very paranoid. My parents loved the city, and they loved Washington Heights. And I grew up on these stories of what a great neighborhood it was. But when I started grad school in the 1980s, one of the big issues that was going on at the time was crime. And it really did change city life. And over the years, I'd sort of kept in touch with what was going on in Washington Heights. I had an aunt and uncle in Inwood. And what struck me in the 80s and in the early 90s was how the neighborhood my parents lived in, that they described so lovingly as a great place for a working family to live, had gotten so dangerous for a lot of people. How the drug trade had become entrenched in parts of it. And I decided at first to just focus on the news media and the drug trade. And I researched how the neighborhood was being covered during the years of the crack epidemic. It became really clear to me that there was a lot more to the neighborhood than the drug trade. But it also seemed to me at the time, thinking about the early 90s now, that there was no good future for Washington Heights and Inwood. I figured the same thing would keep happening. There would be a drug trade, there would be killings, people would be poor, people couldn't get a break. And that was what was going to stay that way. And I set the idea of writing a book about the neighborhood aside. a decade later, a friend of mine who's a neighborhood activist said, you had to come up here. The year was 2003, things are really different. And I was struck by how different things were. Crime was down, people were out using the sidewalks, people were using the parks. There was a local newspaper that was fighting for the neighborhood. And I said to myself, what's going on here? What changed? I got to explain that change somehow. And that's how I settled on writing the book.
So, I mean, they only spent 1 year here, but it left such a deep impression on them that it created this fascination with reconnecting with this neighborhood that you feel is part of your DNA, even though it was 1 year. That's amazing.
You know, it's a really interesting thing. My father's parents were immigrants from what would today be called Russia or Ukraine. And they came to New York City in the early 20th century, and their lives were really quite hard, you know? My grandfather was a house painter. My dad worked with him. And when he moved to Washington Heights, to 550 Fort Washington Avenue, and he married my mom, that was like the best apartment he ever had. You know, two people with a 2-bedroom apartment. I mean, and it was rent stabilized and it was right on the A train. They just thought that was fantastic, right? And my mom had lived in the Bronx. She lived in a lot of different neighborhoods, but by the time she married my dad, she was from living in Morris Park with her folks. And again, a 2-fare zone. She had to take a trolley and a subway to get downtown. All of a sudden, to live right on the A train, they just thought they had landed in heaven, and they were really happy to be there.
Yep. All right. So, you know, can you, concentrating on the book a little bit, I mean, it's been some years since you wrote this book. I wanted to ask you, what have you learned in the years after that, right? What if there's something that you can revise this book, right? If you can go back and say, hey, I didn't pay attention to this, or, you know, whatever, you get my point. What would it be? Like, what would be, you know, the new version of Crossing Broadway?
The one thing that I would do more with, I mean, I focused the second chapter of the book around a killing that took place in Highbridge Park. And that killing grew out of a longstanding attempt by mostly white street gangs to keep young Black and Latinx men out of the Highbridge pool. And I wrote about that in the whole chapter. And I also came across a case in which a Puerto Rican family was firebombed when they moved into Washington Heights. And very recently, looking at a book about a photographer named Luigi, who was very big in New York City in the post-war years, he has a terrific photograph of an African-American mom standing behind a shattered window after her apartment was attacked by a white crowd when they tried to move into Washington Heights. And if I was doing it over again, I would try to dig out more incidents like that, because I think that maintenance of the color line, if you will, in Washington Heights is a critical part of its story. I got it, but I didn't get all of it. And I would like to be able to understand that in more detail. The other thing, and this came out, you know, in conversation with you, if I was doing it again, I would dig in even more on hip hop in Washington Heights. I was in a conversation with a guy at a bar on Broadway in about 160th Street. And he was telling me once, after I had finished the book, unfortunately, that all the credit that goes to the Bronx, really some of that must go to Washington Heights. And I felt that the expressive culture of that time and place could get more attention. If I'd known more about that, I would have run with it more.
Yeah. Referring to that conversation that we had, you know, we were talking about hip hop and exactly what you just mentioned. And to think that, you know, you had said specifically that the person that told you the story, what were they doing in Highbridge Park? Like, what was one of the activities they were doing, if you can?
This guy who was a breakdancer, who was very much associated with the Bronx hip hop scene, turned out to be originally from Washington Heights. And they would go into Highbridge Pool when the pool was emptied out in the off season and do all sorts of moves off the sides of the pool. And that was where they went to dance. And that was a whole new dimension of that park and that pool that I'd ever imagined. And it also meant that this account of the history of hip hop, which emphasizes the Bronx and Brooklyn so much, really needed to be broadened out, that there were things that were going on. I knew about Taki, and I thought Taki was really fascinating because he was a Greek American kid who was one of the first people to tag with graffiti. And that was useful. That was good to know. But there was also a scene which involved breakdancing and music that was in the Heights that I needed to know more about.
Yeah. You know, let me back up for a second, right? Like, you know, just to explain to the participants that are here, I'm a, if you listen to my ramble of a bio, I'm a bit of a historian also, right? But, you know, nowhere near your level, but I do similar tours, right? We probably go over different subject matter, but I think there's a lot of overlapping that takes place. And, you know, for me, growing up in Washington Heights, coming to Washington Heights at first was very traumatic. You know what I mean? Like, I came from the suburbs. I came from, unfortunately, which maybe we'll get into, but I came from military bases. I was born on a military base in North Carolina to a Marine Corps dad. And, you know, I came straight to New York, 191st Street and Audubon Avenue, right across the street from G-Dubs, the school. From San Diego, Camp Pendleton. So, you know, I was growing up with a backyard, a front yard, a train set in my garage, and then all of a sudden I'm living in what I perceived at that time, a cubby hole, you know what I mean? And I get here and, you know, everything is new. Things like being Dominican was new to me. Being Puerto Rican was new to me. I mean, these things were part of my culture, but growing up in San Diego and being on military bases, it wasn't something you really felt or was emphasized much. So when I came to New York, that was an explosion of understanding these two cultures that I come from. Coming to New York, not Puerto Rico or Dominican Republic, is what made me start understanding them. And then also at the same time, hip hop, to go back to what you were saying, because, you know, a lot of people don't think about Washington Heights when they think about the creation of hip hop, which I would assert is probably leans way more on the element, the first element of hip hop, which is graffiti, right? So you mentioned Taki, there's lots like Julio 204, and so on. And sometimes I think that our history gets eaten up by Harlem, right? So like, for instance, what I mean by that is like, you know, you think about where Malcolm X died. A lot of people would refer to it as Harlem, you know what I mean? But it's right there in Washington Heights, right? So it's kind of like the melding of these neighborhoods, having a sibling that is much more famous, you know, because Harlem is definitely known for hip hop also, much more famous and kind of overshadowing, right? This like neighbor, kind of like how I talk about Dominican culture for so long being overshadowed by Puerto Rican, because it's so similar and we're so, you know, intertwined. So, you know, if I can quit my rambling for a moment to think that right now we're entering another phase of Black Lives Matter, right? A movement that is unfortunately more than 100 years old in this country, but we're re-experiencing now. And that these kids were breaking into a pool to practice the beginning stages of what we now understand is a world culture. I would argue this talking about it, but I would argue till I blue in the face is probably our biggest export, right? Culturally in the world at this point, right? Assisted by the internet and all kinds of other stuff. I often joke that the only place we might not see hip hop is North Korea. You know what I mean? So, you know, and to think about they were getting like attacked while the beginnings of this culture were being cultivated. I don't know, for me you know, like it sends, it really kind of ties everything together, right? And it really kind of gives you this picture into to everything you're talking about in a way. So I want to transition to another question, or kind of give you some information about the neighborhood, if that's okay with you. Because like the hip hop history in this neighborhood goes a lot deeper. So for instance, the first real recognized graffiti crew to start, one of the first to start traveling internationally, was a crew by the name of UGA, United Graffiti Artists, that were organized by a man that's still around and still organizing things today by the name of Hugo Martinez. And Hugo Martinez was a sociologist working at CUNY And he started this crew with lots of different members. You know, just to give them some recognition, there's Henry 171, Mike 161, one of my close friends that is a source for this history, Coco 144. Normally when you hear numbers after the tag, that's the block they grew up in, right? Or the actual building number. There was Shasta, there was Amaral Bama, Phase 2, may he rest in peace, Gano 1, SJK 171, Stitch 1, which was Cuban, Slim 1, a Chinese dude, Super Stuff, Charmin 165, which was a woman, Stony, also another woman writer, Riff 170, T-Rex 131. Then you have Cat 187. Cat 187 is one of the head pediatricians at Columbia. Homeboy is Dominican, right? And like through my research of looking into graffiti history, especially with concentrating on Washington Heights, there's a lot of Dominicans, but you know, the same, I made reference to it before, kind of like a history can get lost into a similar history that's right besides it, right? And, you know, it's hard to find information on Dominican graffiti writers unless you're actually speaking to an old school Dominican graffiti writer. And a lot of the times, some of my research, I would even talk to my Puerto Rican brothers and sisters and ask them about Dominican graffiti writers. And I don't know what their intentions were, but it was like, they ain't exist. nah, right? Through learning through people like Coco 144, I learned about a Cat 187, which by the way, also runs Pediatrics 2000. So there's a couple of those in Washington Heights now, which are clinics, pediatric clinics. So to think about this Dominican dude that was writing back in the 60s, that was part of the most legendary crew that was based in Washington Heights. Their headquarters was actually 168th Street. It was actually, the address I was given by 144 was 29 Jamel Place. And it was, don't quote me on this, it was $75 a month. And they got a deal through the city to open up that space, and that was their headquarters. Another spot in Washington Heights that was very, very well known in the graffiti circles that was put together by Stitch, Cat, the artist that I was just referring to, and Snake, is the Writer's Corner, adjacent to the park right on 188th Street. So where Laurel Hill starts, that was pretty much the corner where graffiti writers from around the city, as far as Brooklyn, would come together to congregate, right? Another one was in the Bronx in a train station, but this one predates that one, you know what I mean? So all this history is so fascinating. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Maybe we should get...
It's really interesting to me for a couple of reasons. I mean, a lot of the standard histories that have been written about Dominicans in Upper Manhattan and Washington Heights and Inwood emphasize how Dominicans began to gain political power in Upper Manhattan by getting involved in school board politics, right? And this gave them, you know, a foothold in politics. And, you know, Guillermo Linares, for example, followed that route, you know, and went into elective office eventually. What your account opens up to me, which is really fascinating, what kind of sense of political power, agency, identity, interests did Dominican graffiti writers develop as they worked in and around their neighborhood? I think it's a really interesting question. Did anybody ever talk to you about that at all?
You know, I want to say yes, but what that brings to mind is another subject. And, you know, I go through the book, but I've also seen some other kind of Zoom talks that you've done, and another one that was at the New School, and thinking about the reduction in crime, right? Citywide, but, you know, focusing on Washington Heights, and thinking about that hip hop influence, right? These Dominican graffiti writers, these Dominicans that are more hip hop orientated, mixing that culture along with their Dominican roots and their New York roots that they're building at the same time, and how much hip hop doesn't receive the credit it deserves in the reduction of crime, right? Like,
that's a good point.
Yeah, like, I mean, I'm sorry, please.
No, you know, there was a philosophy that powerfully shaped New York City policing back in the 80s and early 90s called broken windows policing. And the idea was that if you looked and saw signs of this disorder, and sometimes police would interpret graffiti as a sign of disorder, that would mean that much worse crimes were on the way. Now, in fact, some really good research done by a sociologist suggests that that's not true, right? That the visual cues of graffiti and things like that don't mean that a crime wave is about to break out. And I actually think that your observation plus that observation should cause people to rethink how they react to graffiti now and rethink how they reacted to it decades ago when it was first appearing, that it wasn't necessarily a sign of crime or disorder, but it was something else altogether that needed to be understood, right? My friend Mark Nason runs the Bronx African American History Project, and he's made this great argument, which I think is true, that hip hop emerged in parts of the Bronx like Morrisania, where schools suffered terrible, terrible cutbacks.
Hip hop music.
Yeah. Fair point. And what he keeps saying to me is that in a situation where great music programs died and people didn't have instruments to play with anymore, they had to create new forms of music with what they had at hand. And that was turntables, and that was their own voices. And they did that, and it became, as you said correctly, America's greatest export to world culture today.
Yeah, you know, not only the inspiration and the messaging in the music, because I think we focus way too much on some of the more negative aspects, and we forget that those negative aspects that are part of the music are a result of other ills in our society, right? And to a certain extent, it's commentary and storytelling about the effect of these ills in our society, but also the organizations that were part of it. So you refer to the Bronx, and Africa Bambaataa has its own controversies nowadays, but regardless of that, talking about the organization, the Zulu Nation and other organizations, it wasn't Giuliani that really got rid of the Black Spades. It was more like the Zulu Nation absorbed the Black Spades to a certain degree. So, the messaging in the music was really what did it for me growing up. That's what opened the doors. So let me back up a second. And so the people, and you again, like what got me interested into these histories, and there was many factors, right? I moved to this neighborhood. I'm somewhat patriotic because of this military background and growing up in, military bases. And I come to a place named Washington Heights, right? Like Washington Heights. And I started like looking into the history, and I started finding out, oh, wow, a lot of this history I read about or, is given to me in school, I'm actually living in one of these places where it took place. You know what I mean? I can walk to Bennett Park and see like history. I can refer to like the heights, meaning it's just the elevation, and that would make sense why you would build forts in this area, the high ground and so on. So that, along with being exposed to my parents' cultures and their peoples from their countries, because I come to the largest Dominican city outside of the Dominican Republic, period. And then on top of that, like, I just always hip hop, artists like KRS-One, X-Clan, I can keep naming them, but, very socially, minded rap, the kind of rap that I believe was killed by record labels, right? The people that control who gets money for these, right? That kind of went out of style in terms of mainstream hip hop. And then I had these two neighbors I lived with. And on our first conversation, I told you about this. And, I might be really messing up his name, but I used to hang out with these two older men that lived on my block. One of them was George. And George was an 80-something-year-old Greek dude that would sit. And by the way, just to let everybody know, I grew up on 173rd between Fort Washington and Haven Avenue. We grew up on that block, and I would hang out with them on that block, sometimes smoking my blunt while they're chilling there. And they would tell me stories about the neighborhood. They would tell me some stuff I heard, I later read in your book, you know, and they would tell me stories even about like Jack Dempsey hanging out, you know, in the neighborhood, like walking around and stuff. So nowadays, you know, I'm not known for my Washington Heights tours whatsoever. I mean, I'm not organized with it. It's not like I advertise it. It's really off of the back of the work that I do with El Museo del Barrio and Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute, and on my own, where I give walking, I like calling them ethnographic tours. You can call them tours because, you know, you have a doctorates and stuff. But I like calling them ethnographic tours. It sounds fancier. But that, you know, that's obviously the reason why they paired us together. So thinking about that history and thinking about all of this molding together is really, really interesting when you're talking about, you know, a book like this. Yeah, why don't you say something now?
I think the great thing about the tours, both the kind of tours you do and the tours that I've done, is that they force people to come to grips with the geography of the neighborhood. And one of the things that just shocked me when I went up to the neighborhood in the early 90s to cover the media's coverage of the crack trade was how people talked about Broadway as if it was the Berlin Wall. And that's an expression they would use. They'd say Broadway is like the Berlin Wall. Broadway is like no man's land. You got one world on the east side of Broadway, you got another world on the west side of Broadway, as if the two never met, right? And over time, one of the things that I discovered researching the book was that people from very different backgrounds, different walks of life, learned how to cross Broadway, how to work together to fight for their neighborhood and achieve things by fighting together that they could never win if they fought alone. So they had to get out of their own pocket, whether that was Dominican or Jewish or Irish or Greek, and you had to find ways to make common cause with other people. And it wasn't easy, and it didn't always come naturally to people, but anytime anybody wanted anything significant, from political representation to improvements in policing to the creation of public schools, they did that by finding ways to work together. And I thought that was really important to explain to people, because I don't think all the credit for the good things that happen in a neighborhood like Washington Heights should go to Rudy Giuliani or the NYPD. I think there were good things that some cops did, but in general, it was the community that saved itself far more than gets credit. And it wasn't the blessings of the free market that saved the community. In fact, as you see today, with all the problems that small businesses face, with all the problems of high rents, you know, capitalism doesn't serve Washington Heights very well right now. And there are a lot of problems because of that. And I think by going out on tours, what I've tried to show people is how people had to learn to work together all across boundaries that existed mostly in their heads, and how it's people in the community who deserve the credit for reviving the neighborhood in good ways. And I hope that they will then fight to keep it as a healthy place for working families.
You know, I remember first looking at the book, and I chuckled to myself because, like, Crossing Broadway, and you just explained it, right? Very well. Growing up on, you know, pretty much on Haven Avenue, we used to call that side of Broadway the light side. That was our little joke in the neighborhood. We used to call it the light side, and the other side of Broadway was the dark side, right? And this was within, you know, my little group of friends. We were a group. I grew up with mostly Dominicans on the block, but I grew up, you know, at a time in Washington Heights where it was different, demographically. Like, I remember Puerto Rican families in Washington Heights. Nowadays, you know, I remember 176th Street, for some reason or another, 176 between Broadway and Fort Washington. During my childhood in the 90s, I moved to 173rd in 1987. Before that, I was on 191st. There were so many African-American family and Puerto Rican families. And now there's none. I mean, we do have African-Americans in the neighborhood. You know, just off of the top of my head, they're new, right? They're part of the wave of gentrification. So we're talking about a certain, you know, like a certain class or a certain education, you know, level that we're seeing influx, but I'm talking about an old school presence where I saw African Americans that had lived in the neighborhood for a long time, you know? So my friends growing up were very kind of African American, Dominican, of course. We had those Puerto Rican clusters. There was sprinkle of other peoples. There was always Ecuadorians uptown. Hondurians was another smaller group. Salvadorians, I knew a couple in the neighborhood, and it was always funny because the Ecuadorians I would think were Dominican. They would like grow up around Dominicans and kind of like speak in a way that my untrained, you know, Dominican ear would think is Dominican. So that was really interesting to me. I didn't really, except for the other old dude I mentioned, I mentioned George, the older Greek dude, but the other gentleman, I believe his name was Natal Stern. I don't remember too well. He was a Jewish gentleman, and he used to sit outside with the Greek dude, and we just used to talk about history. To be honest with you, I grew up in New York City. I grew up with Jewish people all around me. I went to LaGuardia Music and Art, made really cool friends with lots of Jewish people. Growing up in Washington Heights, I had nothing to do with Jewish people. I mean, not like a choice, like I didn't want to. But it's weird to me that I grew up in this neighborhood that was very Jewish, very Dominican, right? Greek, but they kind of fled. And all of my friends that I've met that are Jewish were a situation where I met them outside school or different things and never mixed with them in the neighborhood. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think about that?
That's typical of life in Washington Heights, and it's typical of life in a lot of New York City neighborhoods, where people think about it. They'll talk about a neighborhood like Washington Heights, but in fact, nobody experiences all of Washington Heights firsthand. What they know most is their block and maybe 5 blocks at most on any direction. And the first time I got into this was when I was in grad school in the early 80s. And I was doing oral history interviews with elderly Irish Americans in Inwood. And I'd ask them, what was your neighborhood like? They'd say, everybody was Irish. I said, really? Everybody was Irish. And yet then I did census research, and in no neighborhood in Washington Heights or Inwood in the 70s or the 80s was there any area that was more than 25% Irish, okay? It was never all Irish. And even like by the early 90s, when the area up around Good Shepherd was 30% Irish, that was the absolute tops, right? And that's because a lot of the older Irish people moved up there to be near Good Shepherd, and they stayed there, and they inflated the numbers of Irish people in the neighborhood. But it's so common in New York City for people to live in these little worlds, micro neighborhoods that never touch the other neighborhood, you know? Corner building in the middle of the block, 2 separate worlds sometimes. And one of the big problems with street crime is it made kids reluctant to play on the street, particularly if they lived on a block where there were lots of drug dealers. The one place where kids could meet is in the streets. And I remember an interview with an elderly Irish American woman where she lived in the southern and eastern part of the Heights growing up. This would have been the 30s and early 40s. And she met lots of kids because she played in the street, and other kids were out in the street. When the streets got violent in the 80s and 90s, kids were kept home, or kids were kept in school to keep them off the streets. And one of the things that my friend Dave Crenshaw did was try to create athletics programs to get kids out of their apartments, playing ball with each other, getting to know each other. He once told me he was so thrilled that he had a basketball program that brought together 2 sets of guys who never would have met each other otherwise. And they said, okay, Dave, who? He goes, well, African-American guys from 165th and Amsterdam, and Dominican guys from 175th and Broadway. Without this basketball program, they never would have met each other. And he was right? He was absolutely right. And the trick of urban life, I think, is to try to create these connections between people who are otherwise apart from each other.
You know, we were talking about the cops before. We were talking about these violent streets and so on. Listen, you know, on my block of 173rd between Fort Washington and Haven that I grew up on, and I say this with conviction, the dude that ran the crack dealers off my block was this dude by the name of Chino. Chino sold drugs. Chino had this kind of philosophy that I would hear in like Italian movies, you know, like mob movies or something, right? Not to glorify them, but he'd be like, yo, I ain't gonna have my block hot. You know, they're doing it wrong. They're selling to the wrong people. They're doing it wrong. So he would clean up the block. This dude had a certain kind of clientele too. Like he would sell weed and sometimes other stuff to mostly nurses and doctors in the hospital right down the street from where I grew up in. So the cops represented danger to me when they came through. When Chino was around, we felt safe on the block. You know what I'm saying? So it really is this weird kind of situation, you know, yeah.
No, one of the statistics that fascinated me is that the drug trade violence went way down in the 2000s, right? It went from more than 100 a year to less than 10 a year in all of northern Manhattan. The number of killings just plummeted, right? But if you look at the admissions to Presbyterian New York Medical Center, in the emergency room, the statistic that the feds ask you to keep, what percentage of people admitted to the emergency room have cocaine in their bloodstream, percentage stays the same. People are still doing drugs. That's not the problem. People are still doing drugs, but the violence around the drug trade has gone down. And one of the reasons for that, and I think you gave it, is it stabilized. And once you had a relatively small number of entrepreneurs running it, they didn't want any competition. And once that competition disappeared, they do it quietly. I would walk around the streets, even sometimes in the West 160s when I was doing the book, and I could clearly see guys who were dealing, right? But it wasn't violent like it was before. And I think that made a huge, huge, huge difference. Congressman Espaillat said something to me once that the blocks where there were drug dealers in the low 160s on the east side of Broadway, he said when he was young, there were just street gangs there, fighting gangs. And those guys kept their own kind of order, which meant keeping the crack dealers out. When those older gang members either aged out or gotten into different ways of life, that created an opening and crack crews went in there.
I find that so fascinating because, yeah, we normally give all the credit. I mean, you know, I know some people want to be diplomatic. I don't give the police force any credit at all. I think they made the situation worse. And I think Giuliani made it worse also. I did live through a time where I would spend, you know, I would have to lay down, face down on the floor every 2 days because I fit the description. And meanwhile, I only tried to sell drugs one summer. I was never good at it. You know what I mean? Like, and it was never me. So that kind of went away. So maybe
well, I'm curious. So if you were a failure at it, why were you a failure, do you think?
Oh, on a lot of different levels. I can make fun that I can't do math to save my life, right? So, you know, bad counts. Also, you know, I don't know. I mean, not to demonize anybody that has done it because people do all kinds of things. I normally compare drug dealers to my family that are in the military. My dad joined the Marine Corps because he had a child to feed. The United States was raping his country, the Puerto Rico, and he joined the military because, you know what? I got to feed my family. A lot of crack dealers dealt crack because they had to feed their family. You know what I mean? Both situations, you're going to do something icky. You know what I mean? Like, here you are helping people die by selling them those drugs. And here you are going to a military where, you know, nowadays you totally don't agree with the president, but you're a soldier. You just follow orders. Well, you went into that knowing that, you know what I mean? So you go somewhere for a bad war and end up killing some other poor person. That's like selling drugs to me. You know what I mean? I don't know. This conversation ain't about like making an equivalency about those two things, but really the way that I look at the war on drugs and what was done and remember growing up in that atmosphere, unfortunately it's still going on, right? Like to different degrees. I think it's affected me a little bit different. Sometimes I try to analyze why. Maybe I'm older, maybe I look more like an artist, maybe I look non-threatening. I don't know what it is. I don't go out as much anymore either. But I find that really, really interesting in terms of who we credit for those things and who we kind of forget about. with that being said, we're going to continue this conversation, but I think it's ready. We're ready for our commercial break. We have a commercial break. So I want to pass it over to the organizers that are going to share one of our sponsors with us.
Hi, everyone. Whew. A real shock there. I am here to report that Angel of Leblanc is coming on towards the end, like closer to 3. So I think that if you wanted to, maybe this would be the time to switch. And if you want to show, well, I don't know, if you can conclude things between the two of you and then also show the artwork that you'll be raffling off.
I can do that.
Angel from Leblanc that's coming on like at the end. So I think that you updated Jackie.
Show the art. Show the art.
Damn, I like this conversation though, but all right, I'll show it.
Yeah. The other thing that I don't know if you can see us messaging you, but if there are any questions from the audience or comments, I don't know if we really have. Now we're almost at the end, but what do we do the art, and then if there's, do you want to do show the art? We can raffle that off if English comes in, and then if anyone has questions, maybe after, so that this part's all within the hour. Okay, this is the art. Do you want to just talk about it a little bit?
Yes, I will talk about it. I'll hold it here for a second so you can check it out. This is a piece that I did, actually really cool. It has to do with Word Up a lot because Word Up commissioned this piece, meaning they did a program where Reynaldo Garcia Pantaleon, I'll hold it up for another second, but I feel weird behind it. Reynaldo Garcia Pantaleon with Word Up organized a print exhibition called El Alto, the Heights, right? So the prompt was to ask artists that have been in the neighborhood for 15 years. They put a cap on it. Like I joke with my wife, she's not really a Washington Heightser because she's only been here for about 13 years. This piece was made talking about Washington Heights. It's a simple block print made with styrofoam, okay? And I kind of, I'm a bit of a troll, so I embraced that idea of kind of crossing Broadway in a way before I read the book, actually. Because if you can notice here, it's done in 3 panels. So I'm actually separating, right? These sections where, I don't know if it picks it up, but it says Washington Heights on the print. And I also made it a mixed media print where I added Black Lives Matter along with the Washington Heights. So in a way, it's a mixed media print using styrofoam, where I'm talking about how Washington Heights growing up for me was very sectionalized, right? And kind of fractured. But at the same time, we can see the art going through the 3 different sections of the print. So that's pretty much what the print's about. I hope whoever wins the raffle likes it. If not, find somebody that likes it and give it to them.
I was really impressed by how people in Upper Manhattan, particularly Inwood, mobilized to fight against the de Blasio administration's rezoning plan. I felt that as it played out over time, people showed the kind of collective efficacy that I think helps explain how Washington Heights and Inwood recovered from the really difficult years. And my hunch on that was borne out because the city did a survey. They asked people in different neighborhoods, if you have a problem, can you rely on your neighbors to help you out? And in Washington Heights and Inwood, the percentage of people who said yes was 10% higher than in the rest of the city. So that shows us there's a collective sense that I think is really, really important. I don't have much to add to that with regard to the zoning, but what I'm really interested in hearing from people about is what's happened during the pandemic and the demonstrations against police violence. I mean, what are we seeing uptown? How are people living through the pandemic and what are they doing in the demonstrations? How is it playing out?
So combining that with Joanna, so I don't know if she's still with us, but Joanna, the former director of NOMA, had asked about Afro-Latinidad and what's going on. It's funny too, because she knows I don't like that word Afro-Latinidad, but I am very, very, I'm very interested, and my work mostly deals with, that subject. Just I name it better, I think. It's something that we're struggling with. I mean, a couple of weeks ago there was kind of a confusion that went on with some of the protests, and I mean, to not go dig deep into the weeds, there was an organizing around Dykeman, under the premise that we are going to protect Dykeman against what had just happened on Fordham Road. And, on its face, I guess, how can you argue with protecting your neighborhood? The problem with that is how it was framed and the historical background that goes along with it. And I think there's a lot of things to be said about it. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine, Shalene Rodriguez, is really, really dope organizer in the Bronx. And, she had mentioned something that I've always noticed, and you had mentioned before. Dominicans uptown are we're compared to a lot of other neighborhoods and a lot of other ethnic enclaves, we're very kind of like economically rooted in Washington Heights. There's a lot of businesses. That's something that I see when I'm looking at East Harlem, which is another neighborhood that I spend a lot of time in, work in, and so on. And, it's Puerto Rican past that is very quickly disappearing, except for like academia about it and so on, right? We're talking about like its past, right? And to think about how, Dominicans are very entrenched economically in Washington Heights. And, this distaste that I kind of had with the protection of property, right? Like they organized, and I don't know everything that happened with the story, but I saw the video of young Dominican men. Some were rappers and dudes that I might have, grown up with, and they were there with the cops. And they were there talking about how they're going to defend their neighborhood because they won't let that happen in a neighborhood. And we're Dominican and we don't let that happen to a Dominican neighborhood. And they were hand in hand with the cops, and they didn't say Black Lives Matter not one time. They didn't talk about the ills of society and what's happening in society that would make that happen. And I bring that up because to me, it ties with, Afro-Latinidad, how, Joanna framed it, and our kind of complicated history with dealing with race. And we've brought that from the Dominican Republic to Washington Heights, and we've compounded that with the history of this country's racist past and what's going on. What do you think about that, Robert? Because you know what? I did get a friend text message me and said, let Robert talk more.
I always get nervous when people talk about defending their neighborhood because you can't have a defense without having an attacker, right? And sometimes the people who are perceived to be attackers are just walking down the street, and, Upper Manhattan has a history of Black people being confined to certain parts of the neighborhood. Back then, the confinement was done by white gangs that would beat guys up if they crossed the wrong boundary line. And I'm really wary when people start talking about defending the neighborhood. And at the same time, I'm also worried when people try to do that on a freelance basis, because some of the ugliest things that happened in New York City, think about Howard Beach, think about Bensonhurst, these begin in attempts to quote unquote defend the neighborhood, and they lead to the deaths of innocent people who are just in the wrong place at a terrible time and assumed to be something based simply on their physical appearance. And I really worry about that. I worry about police violence, but I also worry about communal violence, because there are moments, we've seen it before in the history of New York City, when community bonds get tight and then they get exclusionary and they talk about repelling other people. And that really spooks me. I've seen a lot of comments on Facebook and online about what happened on Dyckman Street. I don't have a full sense of it yet myself, but I get really nervous when people start talking about defending their neighborhood against outsiders who can be identified by their appearance. That's very spooky.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, and one of the things that I've wrestled with, going back to one of the comments I made about relations with Jewish people, growing up in a neighborhood that is largely Jewish, you know, and I can bring this up about other groups also, but, you know, like, hey, how can you treat a new group, right, like this when your history is steeped in fighting similar situations, right? And now I find my people, right, in Washington Heights, because, you know, I'm making this comparison, thinking about the Jewish folks in the neighborhood and the Greek folks, and now here I find Dominicans in a similar situation.
It's a painful truth, but I often think that suffering doesn't bring out the best in people. And you have to work double hard, even if you've suffered, right, to develop empathy for other people. And there's ways that in life in New York City where the sense of psychological distance between that people can have between themselves and their neighborhoods and their neighbors. And the idea that New York City, you got to fight for what you get, that can lead people to think of neighbors as enemies. And there's a long history of that. The cast of characters changes from the 19th century to the present, but we always have to work really, really hard to make sure that problem doesn't mushroom into violence, because it's always possibly there. I think that's something to be really concerned about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So at this moment, I mean, we still have pretty much the same amount of participants. I wanted to see if anybody has a question.
Before we get into questions, now Angela's here. If you want to say, if you're able to say hi.
I'm at Leblanc here on Broadway, and I'm with Angel Barreo. What's the origins of Leblanc?
We've been here with the community for so many years, so we know what they really need. Meats, vegetables, you know, things that they need for like every single day. So you gotta bring things fresh for people and, you know, try to get the best prices for them.
So your products that you have are not just Dominican or Puerto Rican or Mexican or Brazilian. It's the amalgamation, almost of pan-Latin flavors that you bring here at Leblanc.
Well, it is very important because around here there's no more meat markets like for Spanish people. I mean, everything that is in the supermarkets is prepacked. We got everything fresh so people can come to the store and they can see the meat. We just cut them fresh for them. And I mean, we try to get all the products that they really need for the everyday meal. It's very important in this community.
Tell me a little bit why Washington Heights, when it started.
Well, because we speak Spanish, and most of the people around here is Latin, so they speak Spanish too. And that's why we decided to come here.
So what are some of the cuts that people mostly buy?
Oxtails, top sirloin, stew beef, shank. Most of the things that we have in the store, like chickens, drums, boiled eggs, wings, you know, it's something that people buy every day. Now on the weekends, we got the short ribs, we got the flank steak, we got the skirt, we got so many things that they use for barbecues.
What's the next 5 years for Leblanc?
Try to be the best we can with the customers. I mean, be the best with the people and, you know, keep the store like the way it is.
So Angel, thank you so much for having us today. I'm definitely going to be back and, you know, all of the amazing things that you have here. And it reminds me to tell you, did you know it's all in the Heights?
Hi, we showed the video of your interview with Cloth at Leblanc, but if you wanted to just introduce yourself and just say a few words.
Sure. Well, my name is Angel, and I'm one of the owners of Leblanc Meat Market, and we've been here for almost 40 years in the store, so we know the community around here. So, I mean, that's what I can tell you. I don't know if you guys want to know anything else about us.
Is it a family?
What's business like for you lately? How's the pandemic hurting your business?
Well, we don't get any troubles with that because, you know, what we're selling is like things that is for like every single day. So people came to the store, no doubt about it. Well, the pandemic is because we're losing a lot of customers, especially old customers that used to come to the store, and that's the only problem we have right now. You know, is with the families. That's what it is. That's the real problem right now.
We were told earlier that originally it was, and I don't know, maybe it still is, that it was a Puerto Rican owned business.
Yes.
Is it still owned by the same family? Are you?
No, we are a different family. Before, this store has been here since 1960. We got the store from the Puerto Rican guys, from the brothers, and since then we are here. So we've been here almost 4 years.
That's so interesting to me. I mean, I'm Puerto Rican and I'm Dominican, right? And we're talking about this history. And earlier we referred to the fact that there used to be a lot more Puerto Ricans in Washington.
Oh, yes. And Cuban.
Yes. And, you know, so for instance, Caridad, right? Used to be a Cuban restaurant. Yep. Now you see Juan Pablo Duarte on the wall instead of Jose Marti, you know? So
I can tell you all of the restaurants used to be Cubans, most of them. The one that used to be between 157 and 158, Los Parados, I think it used to be called, and the one in the 162nd, you know, most of them used to be Cubans. A lot of Cuban stores around here, liquor stores, everything used to be Cuban. Puerto Ricans used to be the customers, but Cubans used to be the owners. So, you know, we used to have the food time, the super food time in front of the store. So I'm talking like so many years ago, you know, so many old stores, used stores, like the meat market we used to have next door, used to be a used store. And the one that used to be across the street used to be a used store. So, I mean, you know, the neighbor is changing all the time. Now it's a lot of Dominicans, Mexicans, and maybe in the future it's going to be, you know, Americans. You never know.
Okay. And with that being said, how has the business changed for you? Not necessarily in the you know, in terms of COVID, but the last 40 years and how the neighborhood has changed.
Well, the thing is, you know, since we are in the store, you have to get what the store asks you for. You know, since you get new neighbors, you got to get things for new neighbors. You know, you got to move with the new neighbors. You can keep, you know, with the old things. We got to bring new things, like let's say these neighbors, they like steaks. You got to bring the steaks because otherwise you can't survive in the store. So when we see like the changes, people came to the store and we try to, you know, get whatever they need so they can come into the store, you know. So most of the people that we have in the store is like Spanish people. So we know what we bring to the store, you know, things for Spanish people. Sometimes we got problems because Americans, they come to the store, but we didn't have like that much for them. So we got to focus in the new things for them too.
Thank you. That's very interesting. You know, I often talk about a Washington Heights where I remember repair stores on the corner. You can take electronics and get things repaired, and we don't see that no more. And the meat markets.
You used to have a lot of bodegas too. Now we got pharmacies and we got a different store because why? Because they change, the neighbor is changing, and you know, not that fast, but you can tell it's getting like new bars. You see so many bars right now. You see so many restaurants right now. You see so like Dunkin' Donuts. You never saw Dunkin' Donuts around here. Boston Market. You know, different things for different people, from different neighbor. It's like El Barrio used to be Puerto Rican all the time. Now it's Mexican. Yep. Things change.
Yep. What's your address, Angel?
3824 Broadway, between 159 and 160 Broadway, coming up.
Okay. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Now you know some more about Leblanc Meat Market.
Thank you so much, Angel.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Goodbye. You know, Robert, what do you know about the Cuban population in the neighborhood at one time? I have some thoughts. I want you, please.
It's a really interesting question, right? It was fairly pronounced. It was small but visible. in the 50s and early 60s, right? It seems to have preceded the rise of Castro in Cuba, but then it also got another boost from people who came after the rise of Castro. People have offered two generalizations about them. One is when Cubans came and it became pretty clear that Cuba had changed and Batista was not coming back and Castro was going to govern going forward, a lot of Cubans realized that they weren't going back home to Cuba anytime soon. And they made their plans for the future with an understanding that they weren't going back to Cuba anytime soon. Another that I've heard is often people moved from there, Washington Heights, to Hudson County and parts of New Jersey, where there were much, much larger Cuban communities, right? But I've been told that Senator Robert Menendez from New Jersey has relatives still in Washington Heights because, you know, his family made that transition, right? But that the generalization that's been made is that Cubans, sort of like Jews who came from Germany or Jews who came from the Soviet Union, when they got to Washington Heights, figured out pretty quickly that they weren't going back home. And that's something that defined their experience of immigration. Whereas for many Dominicans, there was a desire to go back home, right? There was a desire to go back home and make a revolution. There was a desire to go back home and reunite with family. There was a desire to go back home to the island and create a larger house or a better house for your family. And so, you know, those are two different ways of approaching the immigration experience. And Cubans are on one place, Dominicans, Jews, Russians are in others.
That's really interesting. You know, I'm a bit of a troll because I always just, you know, you can put layers and nuance in it. I've just made a large generalization that they just fled. You know what I mean? Like, you know, darker people started moving in the neighborhood, Dominicans started moving in the neighborhood, and they want to be there, like some other groups. So that's really interesting to me because, yeah, most of these restaurants are Cuban, and sometimes it annoys me because, you know, you'll hear academics, especially like, hey, let's do a show. How about an Afro-Cuban show? And there's like no Cubans around. Like you literally have to like go to Jersey or to like Miami to find the Cubans in terms of populations. And they're really referring to an old history. But like some people generalize Spanish people, right? So you can just put one in for the other maybe, you know what I mean? And I think that's true, especially, you know, like, listening to what you talk about when you go into one of your more deeper, I think, studies or something, which is really focusing on the different kind of Jewish people, right? And like, they're not, you know, monolithic, right? There's like different groups of Jews. I think that's what I try to talk about when we're talking about quote unquote Latinos, right? Like not all the same, sometimes having very different views on stuff, sometimes not wanting to live together. What do you think about that?
No, it's an important idea to keep in the foreground when you think about things. I mean, the other idea that I put behind it also, and it's one you raised and I think it's really important, is a lot of the people who are coming to New York City today and have come here in recent decades are coming from the Caribbean. And New York's connection to the Caribbean is now much more profound than it was, let's say, 100 years ago. New York has always had a connection to the Caribbean. It's changed over time, but the big change since the 1960s is that you have far more Caribbean immigrants coming here. And they're coming here from Spanish-speaking countries or English-speaking countries. But a friend of mine, I at Rutgers, we used to talk about inventing a course we wanted to teach called New York, a Caribbean city, which it really is in a powerful way that needs to be understood. It once drew immigrants from across the Atlantic, but that's declined. It draws immigrants now from the Caribbean, and that's really important to figure out.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, we were talking before and like just thinking about John Rodriguez, some Caribbean dude to begin with, right? I often don't call him Dominican because there was no Dominican Republic at that time. He was a man from the island of Quisqueya. He was a Caribbean man, a black man well, racially mixed man, but black man for all intentional purposes, living on Governor's Island. So, you know, that really, really is fascinating. One of the things that you brought up in our private conversation before we were talking about this, that I literally had to cut you off, right? Because I was like, oh my God, I say that all the times on my tours, was the idea of how different immigrants would view the place they're coming to, view the United States. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. You know, one of the most important things that immigrants bring to the United States is memories of where they started out, right? Now, take German Jews who came to New York City and Washington Heights in the 30s and 40s. They certainly knew that the United States had immigration laws that limited their ability to escape from Hitler, right? But the bottom line was, once they got to New York City and settled in Washington Heights, among other neighborhoods, they felt a refuge from a great danger. Washington Heights for them was a place of refuge, right? The Irish, who came also in their own way, they knew that when they were in New York City, they were no longer under the British crown, or if they came later in the 1920s, they got to New York City and they were free from all the internal conflicts of the Irish Civil War. So for those older generations of immigrants, Washington Heights could seem like a refuge. United States of America could seem like a refuge. But if you look at the United States from the perspective of the Caribbean or from Latin America more broadly, the United States looks really, really different. The United States looks like an imperial power. The United States looks oppressive. The United States intervened in the Dominican Republic in the 1960s. I mean, it basically went to war on the side of one party in a Dominican conflict to put down the left. And when Dominicans came here, it was with a streak of ambivalence about that. And it's understandable. And I think immigrants of different generations, it's good for them to understand that, to understand how the memories that people bring to the United States and to New York shape their reactions to the new country for a while.
Yeah, and I love the way you put it. Of course, you put it a lot more eloquently than me. I often just say that, you know, for people like Dominicans, there's plenty of other peoples too. We ran from the beast to the belly of the beast. You know what I mean? Where, yeah.
There's a famous anecdote by a Dominican historian. He talks about a graffiti up in Santo Domingo during the US intervention, when there was a lot of anger among Dominicans against the United States for invading their country. But there was also a sense among them that if they got to the United States, they might be able to have better lives, at least economically, than they did in the Dominican Republic. And according to this historian, somebody sees a piece of writing up on a wall in Santo Domingo, "Fuera Yankee y llévame contigo." Yankee, go home and take me with you. And I think that gets in one sentence, the mixture of feelings people would have had.
I heard, and I'm not sure about this, that actually gringo comes from the Dominican Republic. I don't know if that's true, but supposedly they were wearing green and they said, go, green, go.
Don't know. I never heard that one before, but that's interesting. We got a question in the chat about Greeks migrating to New York City and Washington Heights. It's worth remembering that the Greek community was relatively small, but it was really important in the minds of Greeks, right? It was really significant. I came across a really interesting book about Greek American culture, and there was a great film noir film, a kind of murder mystery shot by Greek filmmakers in New York City in the 50s. And they put parts of it in Washington Heights and parts of it in the waterfront as well. And somebody inscribed the book and said, before there was Astoria, there was Washington Heights, right? And that's worth remembering too. I have a good friend, Dimitrios Mihalaides. He's Greek, but his family comes from Istanbul. And when times would get hard for Greeks in Istanbul, they would make the move to the United States and show up living in Washington Heights. And he had uncles who would be crashing in his parents' apartment for a couple of weeks before they got settled in New York City. So for a lot of people, it's been a city and a neighborhood of refuge, but that refuge never comes easily to people.
It's funny. I don't mean to reduce a people to their food or their restaurants, but I do miss me some diners. So, and like most of the diners were Greek. A lot of them, at least I went to.
Yeah. I think part of it is the change in work conditions. I really mean it. Once upon a time, you had a lunch hour. It was an hour. You could go out for an hour and eat lunch and get a hamburger and a cup of coffee. Now people grab something from a salad bar and they're supposed to eat at their desk to show what eager beavers they are. I don't think that's healthy.
Also, you had mentioned Astoria, and when we were talking, I had said that your book, there was a lot of cross information between A Tale of Two Cities. And that was one of the things that I said in the book, that the Dominican diaspora in New York supposedly started in Astoria, but then very quickly shifted to like East Harlem and then Washington Heights. And that was interesting to me because I always think about Astoria and I think about diners. You know what I mean? Like,
Sure. I mean, Jesse Hoffman Garskoff has written a really good book about revolutionaries of African and Spanish ancestry who came up from the Caribbean in the late 19th century and lived in the area just south of Washington Square Park. And they had an amazing vision of social justice and revolution and what race should and shouldn't mean in a country. And, you know, they were in New York City. It's really worth remembering that prior to the time when the US took over for the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean, lots of Caribbean peoples thought of New York City as a place to go to plot revolution, as a place that was welcoming to revolutionaries who could then go back to Cuba or Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic and change things. That all changed when the United States picked up from the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean. But until that moment, it looked like a safe harbor for revolutionaries. Think of the years that Jose Marti spent living here, right? And I think as New Yorkers, that's something to be proud of. I like that side of our city's history.
yeah, but I do too, but belly of the beast. You know what I mean? Like, for instance, I'm wearing, you know, the original, well, the second Puerto Rican flag. And, you know, I remember when I was younger researching Puerto Rican history and to find out that this flag was made on 23rd Street in Chelsea, a neighborhood that I always just associated with queer life.
Oh man,
But,
no, Chelsea.
yep. Yes. The treasurer of the Puerto Rican Independence Party was the man that fashioned, and I'm sorry, I'm not an official historian. I don't remember names that good. But the flag was made on 23rd Street. It was not made in Puerto Rico. The flag behind me, which looks like the Dominican flag, that flag was made in Puerto Rico, and it was fashioned after the Antillean Federation flag, which was adopted and made the Dominican flag. And then they based it off of that. But Ramon Emeterio Bentances unfortunately didn't win his revolution, my favorite founding father of the Caribbean. So it never took hold. But exactly what you're saying, the Puerto Rican flag was made in New York. That's because all of the people that were exiled by the Spanish in Puerto Rico ended up going to New York to plot the overtake of Puerto Rico. It's so interesting. It's so fascinating. Yeah. Where do we go now? Do we have any other questions? Because I think we still have almost as many participants that we started off with. So obviously people are still around, but I feel like we can ramble and talk about different subjects all day if we're left to our own devices. And I feel like Veronica has given us, we've gone about half an hour over time. So I want to ask anybody that might still be with us if they have any questions, or Robert, if there's anything that you really want to leave us with in terms of everything that we've been talking about.
Also, Carlos, there's a question in the Q&A box from Cynthia. If you click at the bottom, you'll see this Q&A.
Oh, okay. You see, I was paying attention to the chat joints. Sorry. All right. So, Robert. Oh, no, Cynthia. Okay, Cynthia La Cruz. Any tours or ethnographic tours coming up? Of course, if it is safe to do so and given the current circumstances. Robert.
I want to start giving, I've given tours in the past. I've given 3 kinds of tours. One is to get med students from Columbia out into the community, get them walking around on both sides of Broadway. Another one looks at how the neighborhood recovered from the hard years, looking at places where there are different community development projects. And another one I've done with German Jews, actually, often the children of German Jewish refugees who maybe grew up in the Heights very young, born in New York City, but their parents came from Germany. And I'd like to get back to giving tours. I mean, I've done it before and I'll do it again. And once we're through this god-awful pandemic mess, I would be happy to do that again. I really enjoy it. And I think that from talking to Carlos, I can see all sorts of really interesting kinds of tours that could go beyond anything I've done before.
Speaking of that, yes, as soon as this is done with, me and Robert, hopefully he was serious about it, we're planning on organizing a joint tour. I would love to do that, where we kind of pick our different spots and concentrate on the history that we're really passionate about together on a tour. First, I would love to pick your brain alone, though, to be honest with you. But maybe we can talk to Word Up about maybe organizing something like that for later on in the summer, maybe.
That would be cool. That would be really cool.
Okay, that's great. So I hope that answered your question, Cynthia. I'm so down to do it. I'm really excited to do it. So yes. Let me see, Veronica, maybe you can help me out. Do we have any other questions? I see yes, please, sounds cool, but not necessarily a question. Okay.
A question earlier in the chat and I've lost it. So if anybody still had that question and wants to repost it, either in the chat or Q&A, feel free. Otherwise, unless you have any more for each other, we can conclude. How are you feeling?
I'm
ready to conclude, but I want to conclude with a thank you. This has been a really great conversation, and I want to thank Carlos for being a great conversation partner. I learned a lot, and I hope to share a platform with him again down the road, on the street maybe. That'd be great.
I hope so too, and I want to thank you for spending this time with, speaking with me. And also, once again, to Jackie, Cloth, New York, Word Up, especially to Veronica. Like I said at the beginning, that I've always felt your support. And I'm looking forward to I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation, whether it be in tour format or a future Zoom call or whatever it is. This is really dope. Thank y'all.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.